Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning for those of you who are early in your morning, and welcome to this webinar on the differences between ISO 27001 and SOC 2. I'm Alan Calder. I'm the Chief Executive of GRC International Group. It's a UK-listed cybersecurity and privacy specialist with a growing business based in New York and spread across the whole of the United States. IT governance is the single source for everything to do with IT governance, cyber risk management, and privacy compliance. We have deep understanding of privacy regulation in most jurisdictions around the world and of the relationship between privacy and cybersecurity, and particularly how those issues are tackled and dealt with through compliance frameworks, particularly, of course, compliance frameworks which are recognized in more than one country. Apart from being Chief Executive of GRC International, I've also written a number of books on the subject of privacy or ISO 27001 or compliance. And I've taught a lot, our clients, delivered a lot of consultancy. And so what I'm sharing with you today is based very substantially on our real experience over the last nearly 20 years in terms of delivering solutions to clients, but also in working on the development and implementation of frameworks and standards internationally. As a business, just to give you a sense of what the group is, GRC, governance, risk management, and compliance is the broad heading of what we do. Cyber resilience is the biggest part of our activity, dealing with data protection, cybersecurity, ISO 27001, SOC 2, penetration testing, PCI, and so on. We also have a big activity around governance and risk management, dealing with service management, a range of other national and international standards, and we deliver services through a range of different channels, starting from books and documentation template toolkits in our publishing division. We have a software tool set in our software business. We deliver training, both self-paced and instructor-led, mostly online, live online, but also obviously in a venue classroom. We have technical security testing, legal compliance testing, legal consultancy services, and a very substantial consultancy and compliance activity that supports all of our clients. So that's the GRC one-stop shop. And as an organization, as I said, we've dealt now through 15 years, originally founded about 20 years ago. Initially just primarily a publishing business. We're now pushing 200 employees and folk who work with us looking after clients, 12,000 clients across 6 continents, and delivered something in excess of 4,000 training solutions to our various clients. So a fairly substantial and growing operation. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the similarities and differences between ISO 27001 and SOC 2. I'll touch on the certification compliance process between those two standards, a brief look at how you might decide which of the frameworks is going to be right for your organization. We've got about an hour scheduled, or we've got an hour scheduled for this webinar today. I'm hoping that you may have questions, so please do make notes of them when we come to the Q&A section, which with a bit of luck will be 45 or 50 minutes from now. There will be time for you to ask questions, which I will answer. There is a chat function here in WebEx. Please do at any time feel free to use the chat function to send me and my team specific questions or issues you want us to address. We'll pick them up and we'll share them or deal with them as the case may be. So do use the WebEx chat function, as I said, to communicate with us during the currency of this webinar. So ISO 27001 versus SOC 2. ISO 27001, its full official title is ISO IEC 27001, colon 2013. That's because it's a standard put together by the Joint Technical Committee of the International Standards Organization and the International Electrochemical Organization, and it's published in 2013. SOC 2 is the statement on compliance, number 2. There are a couple of others, but SOC 2 is the version we're looking at, particularly dealing with security and the trust principles. ISO 27001 is a publicly available standard. You can buy it from ISO, you can buy it from ANAB. In the US, you can buy it from other bodies. And it's an international standard, so it sets out a specification. It's what a specification does is describe the things that an organization must do if it wants to be recognized as complying with the specification. It's a best practice ISMS, so the creation of ISO 27001 is drawn on input organizations and specialists and experts around the world who contribute to the development of the standard. It was first published as a British standard way back in 1990s. It became an international standard, and it's grown as an international standard over the last 20 years or so. So it's an international standard. It is the same in every country. It can be in different languages, but it's saying exactly the same thing everywhere. If you get certificated against the standard by what's called an accredited certification body, that certification is valid everywhere in the world. So if you have a UK subsidiary that is audited and certified by a British accredited certification body, that certification is valid in the United States, in Canada, in Asia Pacific. It's internationally recognized certification against an internationally recognized standard. It's designed and written so that an organization can align its cybersecurity practices with internal business and external compliance, risk management and governance drivers, typically legislative. And it's designed fundamentally to help organizations manage the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of their data, what are usually called the C/I/A of information. And confidentiality, integrity, and availability are at the root of just about every single piece of legislation dealing with security, which is one of the reasons why ISO 27001 is a very effective mechanism for demonstrating compliance with legislation on an international basis. It's a standard which encourages both a bottom-up approach in terms of thinking about what's happening on the ground, but in particular looks for a top-down approach from management, driving better performance of the organization in terms of how people, the processes in place, and the technology components of the organization are aligned to ensure that the organization's key assets, its key data, its key information, personal data, its key client relationships and so on are properly protected, and the organization itself is protected from the range of threats that exist in today's environment. The standard is, in terms of uptake, running typically at between 15 and 25% increase year on year in the number of organizations who are adopting the standard. And as I said, the fact that the standard is internationally recognized and certifications are internationally recognized means that more and more organizations look to ISO 27001 rather than a national standard as something which is capable of giving them a both national and international exposure. So that's ISO 27001. ISO 27001 is built around 10 clauses, the most important of which start with clause 4. Clause 4 is about the external environment and the requirements on the organization for alignment with business requirements and in terms of legislative and other compliance requirements. But it looks for leadership, so clause 5 in the standard, there are only 10 clauses, 1, 2, and 3 are the ones which basically set out how the standard is written. So you don't have to comply with them. You comply with clauses 4 through 10. Clause 5 sets out how leadership is expected to perform. It deals with top management leadership. It sets out some performance criteria for what good leadership, good commitment from senior management looks like. Clauses 6 and 8 specifically deal with risk assessment and with how the management system, the information security management system, is operated. And the risk assessments and how operations work are going to affect how you plan to deploy your information security management system, how you support it, how you evaluate the effectiveness of the management system, and how you drive continual improvement. So an ISO 27001 management system is not offering to give you total protection against cyber threats. What it is giving you is a structured way in which management can identify the risks which are most likely to impact the organization, to determine the mitigations or controls which can be put in place to reduce the likelihood or impact on the organization of one of those risks if it materializes, and which over time enables you to get better at identifying and mitigating risks. So fundamental to the idea of ISO 27001 is the idea of continual improvement, and the idea that you need to build defense in depth. You need to recognize that attackers have more than one way of getting inside an organization, and that you need to be able to deal effectively with all of the possible ways that they can attack you. There are a number of benefits to an organization achieving ISO 27001. I've picked out 9 in particular. Obviously, it's designed to secure information in all formats. It's not just cyber data or digital data. ISO 27001 is written to deal with physical information, paper information, wherever it's stored, however it's accessed. It's capable of being flexible in any way that you need it to. It's a standard which is built in a way that, because it has internal management audit as part of how it operates, you can avoid frequent external audits, which are usually pretty expensive and so worthwhile avoiding. The continual improvement drive means that you don't need to have quite as frequent external audits. It protects the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. It doesn't just secure all forms of data, but secures the CIA of all data. Because it helps you respond to evolving and developing security threats, it builds on and helps improve organizational culture. It helps the enterprise have a better understanding of security. It builds cybersecurity right the way through the organization, which is a key part of improving morale and improving the effectiveness of the business. And that also feeds through in terms of winning new business and retaining existing customers. We see increasingly clients are more likely to deal with those suppliers who can demonstrate effective cybersecurity. People like working for organizations who can demonstrate that personal data is protected. And because ISO 27001 is an independent standard, when an organization is saying they're certified to it, of course, what they're doing is saying they're certified to an independent standard. They're not just saying we're secure, trust us. They're saying we're secure to a standard that you yourself can read. We have been audited by an independent certification body to it, and we know, and you can therefore know that what we're saying is genuine. Because it's a structured approach, because you don't have to work out how to implement it, it's a much more cost-effective way of building an information security program in the organization than simply bringing in an expert and letting the expert team work it out for you. And it facilitates compliance with laws and regulations because of the underlying CIA drivers for ISO 27001. So it's a structured, effective, meaningful standard that really does support organizations and how they tackle cybersecurity in the organization. SOC 2, on the other hand, is a very security-focused framework. It's focused on what are called the 5 trust service principles. security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. And an organization can implement any 1, 2, 3, or 5 of those trust principles. Each one of them is written in quite a lot of detail, but there are 5 specific separate trust service principles. SOC 2 is designed to give assurance to an organization's customers that the security of its systems meet a specific technical standard. And SOC 2 is a security standard which is written to give a small number of clients satisfaction that standards are met. It's created by the American Institute of CPAs, the AICPA, so it's in that sense an own standard. It's not a public standard developed by international contributors like the international standard is. It's developed by North American, specifically CPAs based on their understanding of the best way to tackle cybersecurity, primarily for digital and cyber businesses operating in the digital world. It focuses on services, people, processes, and technology that supports those processes. It's a very substantial standard, so the trust principles are quite significant. There are 61 individual compliance requirements. Each one of those are requirements. So depending on the number of trust service principles that you're implementing, those compliance requirements will be parceled out. So if you're implementing just one of the trust service principles, you don't have to implement all 61 of the compliance requirements. But typically, if you're implementing SOC 2 for its full benefit, if you have a client who's insisted on SOC 2, typically you would be implementing all 61 of the compliance requirements. And the implementation of compliance requirements under SOC 2 is a specific requirement. There is a standard to which it has to be implemented. With ISO 27001, you have 114 controls. The controls are selected on the basis of a risk assessment. They're not mandated. The compliance requirements in SOC 2 are mandated on the basis of the trust service principles that you choose. So while on the one hand, you might think that SOC 2 only has 61 compliance requirements and ISO 27001 has 114 controls, the basis on which you choose what to select or what to implement is different in each case. So it's not a clear comparison to 61 very specific compliance requirements in SOC 2. There are a number of clear benefits to SOC 2. Obviously, it secures information. That's what it's designed to do. It's a set of very specific controls designed to secure information within the scope of the standard. It will reduce the need for frequent external audits. So under SOC 2, you're going to have a single audit from the SOC 2 auditor on an annual basis. But you will not need to have your client come and do audits, because typically the client for SOC 2, as under ISO 27001, will rely on the fact that you have an externally audited management system in place, that it gives them the satisfaction they need that security is adequate. SOC 2 protects security, availability, integrity, and confidentiality of data. It helps win new customers and retain existing customers. It helps respond to existing and evolving security threats. It does help improve the corporate culture, so structure, focus of people involved in security, all of those get to improve because they're exposed to and have to contribute to the effective working of SOC 2. And the independent approach to assessment gives customers a view as to the fact that while you say you might be complying with SOC 2, the fact that you're audited gives your clients a point of comparison. It can be less expensive than doing it all on your own, and it facilitates compliance with laws and regulations. So in terms of benefits, on the face of it, they're very similar. ISO 27001 and SOC 2 look very similar in terms of the benefits that you get as a client. Similarities stand out. They each have a third-party assessor. ISO 27001, you have a third-party certification body who will do a certification audit every 3 years. SOC 2 has a third-party CPA who will do an audit every year. Customer trust, it's slightly different because while the ISO 27001 audit is a third-party audit and is officially legally available to everybody who reads it, a SOC 2 audit, which is also an independent audit, is a second-party audit, and technically the audit report is available only to the organization who is paying for the audit and the organization who has been audited. Both are internationally recognized. There are different levels of recognition in different marketplaces, but they are both capable of international recognition. And above all, they both deliver benefits in terms of information security. They drive effective cybersecurity controls that, as I said before, protect the confidentiality, integrity, and privacy and integrity of data inside the organization. There are some key differences, though. ISO 27001 is about building a management system. It's driven by top management. It focuses on the risk assessment, and the risk assessment is what determines the controls that the organization puts in place. And ISO 27001 is written so it can be scaled to meet the size of the organization. A small organization will have very limited amounts of documentation and not many controls, because that's kind of how small organizations operate. Corporates or enterprises will have much more in the way of documentation, much more in the way of sign-offs, much more in the way of controls, because that's how large organizations operate. SOC 2 is a very specific set of controls. So small organization, large organization, the amount of documentation required is pretty much the same. The evidence required that the control is operating is pretty much the same. It doesn't focus on the creation of a management system. It focuses on putting in place controls which demonstrate that the data that's in scope for the control framework is being controlled in line with the requirements of whichever of the trust service principles are in place. And trust service principles is another aspect. With ISO 27001, you know that an organization who's implemented the standard must have implemented controls that deal with confidentiality, integrity, and availability. You either implement ISO 27001 or you don't. SOC 2, you implement one of, two of, three or four or five of the trust service principles. So when somebody says they have a SOC 2 certification, you don't necessarily know whether they've got all 5 service principles in place or not, and therefore you can't immediately tell how, broadly speaking, they have dealt with their security. On the other hand, given to the application of SOC 2 is usually driven by a specific client who wants particular aspects of your security certificated, it can be a more cost-effective method of demonstrating that if it's integrity of data, then it's integrity of data that you've dealt with, and you don't need to worry about anything else. So there are differences in terms of how you might apply ISO 27001 and SOC 2. One is a all entity management system that generates benefits which are much broader than simply cybersecurity or confidentiality, integrity, and availability being safeguarded. SOC 2 is much more limited in terms of what it's applied to, much more specific in terms of how it operates. Both require third-party assessors, but again, there is a key difference here. The ISO 27001 assessor is a recognized certification body, and there are certification bodies who are recognized by the national accreditation body in the US, that's ANAB. ANAB accredits certification bodies or registration bodies who can do a certification audit or registration audits of a management system. This is a third-party audit. Once they publish their opinion, it's available and can be legally relied on by anybody. The audit is, the certificate has a 3-year validity. So at the end of 3 years, the certificate will expire. the assessor will come and repeat the audit, and will be looking for the fact that you have maintained the management system on an interim basis. A SOC 2 audit, on the other hand, is carried out by a licensed CPA, a certified public accountant. Not all CPAs offer the service. It's a second-party audit, so typically the audit letter is written to the company who has paid for the audits to happen. That's usually the organization itself, and the certificate, the compliance audit expires at the end of a year. So at the end of the year, you need to have the audit replaced, carried out again. So you've got a very different cost profile between ISO 27001 and SOC 2. An ISO 27001 audit, which will take a number of days depending on the size of the organization, is repeated only once every 3 years. SOC 2 repeated once a year. And you're paying very different fees. With a CPA audit, you tend to be paying CPA fees. With a SOC 2, with a ISO 27001 audit, you tend to be paying fees for assessors. There tends to be quite a lot more competition around ISO 27001 audit fees. So that tends to play out in terms of how the cost of the audits affects an organization. The take-up of ISO and SOC is different internationally. SOC 2 is more recognized in North America. It evolved as a mechanism for organizations to get satisfaction that the control environments of their key suppliers met a standard that would be satisfactory under Sarbanes-Oxley and the PCAOB requirements. And it's evolved to include security as one of its key elements. ISO 27001 evolved internationally, specifically to deal with cybersecurity and to deal with organizations who wanted to demonstrate a very broad cybersecurity awareness and posture. So ISO 27001 works for any organization in any sector that's looking to implement information security best practice. It's designed, it's completely sector agnostic, it's technology agnostic. SOC 2 tends to be prevalent in SaaS companies, in digital organizations. It tends to be focused on the cybersecurity controls and the trust environment that a customer wants to be able to rely on as part of their own control environment. That's why a statement on compliance from a SOC 2, a CPA audit, tends to fit into the compliance audits as part of a broader compliance and statutory or financial audit for a larger organization. SOC 2 renewed every year. The certificate's valid for a year. ISO 27001 renewed every 3 years on the basis the organization carries out internal audits itself on an interim basis. So clearly a very different cost framework, clearly a different external environment and external input. The biggest impact really is going to be in cost of initial audit. We find typically that ISO 27001, the initial certification audit, could be a third of the price of the initial SOC 2 audit. But that again can depend on market forces and who's doing what, but there is quite a significant price difference right up front. The certification process is pretty similar for both frameworks. The starting point is, what are you currently doing? Most organizations are doing some form of cybersecurity. So the starting point is a gap analysis. What are you currently doing? How different is that from the requirements of ISO 27001 or SOC 2? There's no point starting to implement something if you're already doing it. The implementation project is about closing the gaps between what you're currently doing and what you need to be doing in order to pass an audit. So gap analysis produces a documented gap analysis report. Out of that, it's possible to identify what the key security objectives are that you're trying to achieve as an organization, and those might be which trust service principles you are seeking to apply, or there might be the particular security objectives that you're seeking to apply across the organization, which could tie into specific legal requirements or contractual requirements, the case may be. Out of that, you identify the security controls that you need to have in place, either referring to the Annex A of ISO 27001, which lists 114 controls, from which you select the ones that help you mitigate the risks that you've identified. For SOC 2, you identify the controls that are mandated for the trust service principles that you're applying, and you identify the gap between what you're currently doing and what you need to be doing in order to meet the control implementation requirement. You write the documentation. You either write that from scratch or you buy a documentation toolkit that comes with most of the documentation in it so that you can adapt that for your own set of controls. You do an internal audit, whether you're doing ISO 27001 or SOC 2. It's the least expensive form of making sure that your management system, your SOC 2 compliance requirement is meeting requirements, because you can identify where there are shortfalls and fix them. And you'd have the internal audit done by somebody other than whoever's done the implementation. You want a fresh eye on what you've done, preferably from somebody who's an experienced auditor. And that while that's internal audit, of course, you can hire somebody to come in just to do that internal audit for you. Once you're happy that your audit has identified and you fixed, you might want to re-audit, but you fixed the identified weaknesses, your external audit can then go ahead. It's usually a good idea to pre-book the external audit, so auditors tend to be booked up quite a long way in advance, and that can bring a sense of pressure to your project. And that sense of pressure is probably not a bad idea. There's quite a lot of work to do in terms of implementing ISO 27001 or SOC 2, and so having clarity about when the end point is, that's when the audit's taking place, can be a good way of ensuring that the project continues on track what you're looking for. We have seen projects where the end point is not set, there isn't an external audit planned, and stuff happens. Management lose direction, there's an acquisition, there's a takeover, there's some problems to deal with, the project gets derailed, and it's very difficult to pick up because there wasn't a target deadline to be going for. So focusing on where you want to get to is quite an important part of setting up your project. Certification process, pretty much the same. How you go about implementation is slightly different though. So with your ISO 27001 ISMS, there are 9 steps to the process. You start with a project mandate. The first steps are quite easy. Project mandate signed off by management. We've got the resources committed that we need. We kick the project off with a project meeting, make sure everybody's on board with what we're trying to achieve. And then we start work on creating the information security management system itself. That's about determining what controls you already have in place, determining what customer requirements there are, customer contractual requirements or legal requirements there are that you need to be meeting and identifying those. And then you start creating the management framework. How is management going to address the requirements of the standard? How is leadership going to be identified? What training do you need? And out of that, you can create your baseline security criteria. These are the minimum controls that we have to have in place in order to meet our regulatory and contractual requirements. And once you've done that, your risk assessment identifies additional risks about which you're concerned. And the combination of your baseline security controls and your risk management or your risk identified controls gives you the controls that you need to implement. And you then move into implementation, which tends to be quite a substantial portion of the project, making sure that your controls are in place and working effectively. Typically, you'll start measuring effectiveness fairly quickly after deploying the control, so you can start driving improvements, but you'll want to have the measuring of how well the control is doing at reducing ransomware attacks, for instance, or reducing the number of times people accidentally release data onto the internet. Whatever the threats are you've identified, you'll want to identify the extent to which your mitigation controls are reducing them. And once you've got that all in place, you'll go and seek certification. Whereas IT governance in the USA, we help organizations prepare for ISO 27001, we help through all these 9 steps. We obviously don't do certification. We introduce our clients to certification bodies so that the client can select an independent certification body that can help do the certification of the management system. We know that what we put in place will meet the requirements that any certification body audits to. So that's the implementation process for ISO 27001. For SOC 2, while there's a gap analysis, the key decision is which trust service principles are we going to be putting in place. While the general security controls trust service principle has a general requirement across confidentiality, integrity, and availability, they are the core security controls. It's not the broad depth of controls that focus on the areas that are covered by the other trust service principles. So you could limit your implementation simply to the first trust service principle, general security controls, that if that satisfies the customer. As I said, mostly you're implementing SOC 2 because you have a specific customer that requires it. If your customer is happy with the general security controls principle, then that's cool, that's what you're going to implement. But typically a client will want more than that. So you will have a conversation with the client. You will then select which of the additional controls you put in place, and you'll be looking at making sure that the additional controls for that trust service principle are there and are documented and can be demonstrated as working, so that when you seek a external attestation of compliance, the attestation includes that trust service principle. So it's a gap analysis. What have you got in place? Which trust service principles do you have to implement? What are the additional controls you need to put in place to meet not only the specific trust service principle required, but also the general security controls principle that is required as a base for every implementation. Which framework is right for your organization kind of depends on a couple of considerations. And we know organizations that have done both because both frameworks are great for demonstrating security compliance. They've got different drivers. ISO 27001 tends to be the better standard for demonstrating international compliance because it's understood internationally. A German client will understand ISO 27001 from a US supplier. A US client will increasingly understand ISO 27001 from a Japanese supplier. So ISO 27001 tends to be preferred for organizations that want to be able to demonstrate that they're meeting more than one set of compliance requirements and that they are able to demonstrate through their management system that they are regulatory or legal compliance requirements as well as specific contractual requirements. SOC 2 is more recognized in North America and the US. It's increasingly being looked for from organizations in the EU and across Asia Pacific, where clients are saying, actually, because you're part of our control environment, we want you to have SOC 2. We need you to do that. We're relying on you. You're providing staff awareness training, which is a critical part of our overall activity. And so the client driver will tend to be the important consideration in terms of which framework you might look at. The second issue that you might be looking at, and I'll come back to next steps, is of course going to be cost. Usually the reality of a SOC 2 compliance route is it's much more expensive than ISO 27001, both for the initial certification and for the repeat certifications. You've got your 3-year cycle in ISO 27001 as against the 1-year cycle for SOC 2. So you've got both what does my client require? ISO 27001 is valid for all clients. What does my client require? SOC 2 is usually valid for me and the clients to whom I share that SOC 2 report, but SOC 2, typically the clients generally can't rely on that report because they haven't commissioned it. So there are different legal implications for which SOC 2 route, which compliance route you go. So what your client requires, what's the cost, those are the two big considerations that organizations need to pay attention to. we're happy to help clients go down either route. So we have, because more clients tend to prefer ISO 27001, it has broader applicability. It works with more contracts and regulations. It's more adaptable. We have more clients that do it. We have a much wider range, therefore, of products and services that can be deployed to do that. It's much more in these areas off the shelf, if you like, because it's been done so many times and done internationally. So there are foundation training courses, which can help for general awareness, and implementation training course. So for organizations who want to have a much bigger handle on implementing it themselves, training on how to do that. There are documentation toolkits, and there are fast track programs where essentially the consultancy team, the IT governance consultancy team for organizations up to 500 in number, will basically do most of the work. We'll help you achieve it quickly and cost effectively. It takes an awful lot of pain out of the exercise for you. It's typically a fixed price, fixed scope effort. So that's how you can tackle ISO 27001. SOC 2 is much more custom for an organization. The SOC 2 principles, the trust principles, are going to depend, as I said, on which your client requires you to implement, and the way in which you go about implementing them. While the controls are very specific, how you close the controls requires, to a considerable extent, the expertise of a SOC 2 expert. So it's not as easy to set out what the route to compliance looks like. Typically, it's talk to one of our SOC 2 compliance experts. The gap analysis will help us look at what the route to compliance might look like. And typically, a SOC 2 project depends very much heavily on implementation support from SOC 2 compliance experts. It's much harder for the organization to have a role in doing that themselves. And it's a much more custom, much more bespoke project. So quite often the implementation costs for SOC 2 tend to be higher than the implementation costs for ISO 27001 as well. It's not always the case. The third differentiator is, of course, size of organization. And it tends to be that for a much smaller organization down in the 50 to 250 employee area, for instance, SOC 2 can be a very expensive route to go. It can be quite cost effective when you have a small number of very important large enterprise clients, and you're a 1,000, 2,500, 5,000 employee organization. So as I said, that's the third criterion, is the affordability, not just the price, but the affordability of your certification route. So I'm stopping there for questions. It's taken almost exactly 45 minutes, which is what I thought. Please do use the function, type any questions you've got in there. What I'll do is I'll read out the questions and then I'll answer them. So the first question was earlier on: which is better to start with, SOC 2 or ISO 27001? And I think the answer, I mean, I've partially answered that, but it's going to depend on what's driving you. If you're not currently being pushed by a client to implement SOC 2, I would suggest implementing ISO 27001. ISO 27001 will give you the management system. It will give you the control framework, which you can, at a later point, if you need to, put more detail into to help meet a set of SOC 2 compliance requirements. The SOC 2 requirements are much more specific in terms of what the controls are, and so they're more expensive to implement, more expensive to audit. ISO 27001 allow more room. There's more flexibility in terms of how you adapt to and recognize the risk. So it's a more pragmatic route to go, unless, as I said, you already have a client who's pushing you to implement SOC 2, or it's a specific requirement for your organization. Start with ISO 27001. So second question, SOC 2 includes security, availability, confidentiality, integrity. Security, yes, the trust service principle that includes CI&A, the first trust service principle, which you have to implement as part of SOC 2, does indeed deal with general security in terms of general CI&A, but it doesn't give you the robustness and depth of controls that go with implementing one or more of the other 4 trust service principles. It doesn't give you the depth of control that goes with identifying that you have specific risks. ISO 27000 risk assessment would drive you to do that, which would lead you to put in place additional controls over and above the core trust services principle. If you're ready, are they referring to security, physical security, or no, security from a SOC 2 point of view is the application of the principles of security of information specifically in a identified scope. It's not dealing with physical security specifically, it's dealing with security of data. It might pick up physical security if that is relevant to the security of the data, but it's dealing very specifically with digital data. If you're ready, the fact of having a third being done by a specific board of CPAs could be one of the reasons to make SOC 2 more expensive than ISO 27001. Yes, that's correct. It can implement the SOC 2 roadmap as well. If you go to the CPAs to help the implementation process, that will certainly cost you more. The CPA's typical offer is to say, we'll do the pre-audit check for you as well, because that'll identify everything that you need to do well, but that's at CPA rates. You can come to a non-CPA organization like us and we'll do the help with implementation, the pre-CPA audit, all of that at a very different rate than the CPA will, which can bring the cost of preparation down quite considerably, but you still got to pay for the full CPA audit, which is done to their level of standard. I'm glad to see you guys are hammering questions up there. So I think that answers the question about expense of ISO 27001, of SOC 2 in relation to ISO 27001. SOC 2, because it's a proprietary standard, there are not many books written about how to implement SOC 2. It's not something to which you can go on public courses. So the only way to get deeper tends to be to get hold of a SOC 2 compliance expert or read some of the freely available information on audit company websites, but it's not something which CPAs like to publish large books or manuals about. It gets in the way of what they can earn in helping you prepare for and comply with it. So nothing, I'm afraid, we would recommend in terms of reading it. You could use the NIST security or NIST privacy framework as part of either an ISO 27001 or SOC 2 audit. What the NIST framework is doing, the cybersecurity framework is doing, is typically focusing on a system in an organization. It's looking at the controls that system needs to have in place. And it can be useful, therefore, in terms of helping define how you go about implementing a SOC 2 framework, because it gives you 3 different sets of controls looking at a particular system. But it can also, because you're complicating, you're then giving yourself the challenge of looking at how do I read across from NIST to SOC 2 or NIST to ISO 27000 or SOC 2. You can give yourself an awful lot of time spent on tying standards and frameworks together. Another route to go is to turn to a tool like Vigilant Software Cyber Comply, which is designed to map ISO 27001 controls to those in NIST cybersecurity framework, to SOC 2 controls, because that means you can focus on putting in place what will serve the risk need and enable you to demonstrate compliance to multiple controls. And I know that dealing with federal government, demonstrating compliance with NIST can be a key element in contractual requirements. So confidentiality, what's the difference in SOC 2 between privacy and confidentiality? Privacy is about ensuring the privacy of individual data. Confidentiality is about ensuring that data is held confidential. So if I want some information to be confidential, that means it's accessible to anybody who I've authorized to see that information. So in a listed company, in a quoted company, all the market-sensitive financial information is confidential and restricted to the financial team and senior management right up to the point where it's released to the market, and at that point it ceases to be confidential. Privacy, though, is dealing with the right to privacy of an individual. If you employ a lot of people, you've got legal requirements around, depending on which state you're registered in. You've got requirements around protecting the privacy of individuals. You've got requirements over whether or not you can sell their data. You've got requirements in terms of reporting breaches in relation to personal data. And how you go about identifying and protecting personal information is what the privacy control is about. And the privacy control never goes away. So unlike confidentiality, which can change depending on the information life cycle, the privacy requirements don't change because your obligation to protect the privacy of people or PII doesn't change. I hope that makes clear the difference between those two. If a client insists on SOC 2, is there one argument? The one that we recommend clients mostly try is say, yeah, we'll happily do SOC 2. Would you please pay for the audit? If you're happy to accept an ISO 27001 certificate, we'll do that ourselves because we'll get benefit much more broadly than just meeting your requirements. Most of our other customers will accept ISO 27001 certification, whereas you specifically want SOC 2, so please would you pay for the SOC 2 audit? We find quite often the client says, hey, you know what, just do ISO 27001, we'll live with that. But the environment in which the client can genuinely say that the service you are providing is a critical part of their control environment, which means that technically at least 10% of their control environment depends on what you're providing. They might insist on SOC 2, and then you've simply got to negotiate over the cost of doing it and the value to you of their business. But it's a commercial haggle, I'm afraid. I believe we're circulating the reports. It's very difficult to give you a sanitized sense of certification costs. We can tell you what typically certification bodies charge for ISO 27001 certification, because that's based on a combination of their day rates. You can phone them up and say, what's your day rate? And what is required under ISO certification standards as being the number of days necessary to audit an organization of a given number of people. So that's a relatively clear and transparent number. It's less transparent around what a SOC 2 audit cost might look like. Where an entity fails in ISO 27001, is there a wait period before they have a reassessment? The service auditor is paid twice. Yep, they come back and do it. We have never had a client fail a certification audit. So we give all of our clients who come to us for ISO 27001 preparation a guarantee that they will pass an audit. We've done ISO 27001 so often that we know that we will pass it. If the client fails, we will bear the cost of dealing with that ourselves. And typically one of the differences is that the certification audit may pick up a number of minor non-conformances, and the certification audit will agree certification on the basis you demonstrate you've closed those. If the miss is significant, and as I said, I've never known that happen, then they might want to come back. With SOC 2, if the miss is significant, they will want to come back, and it's a time and materials process. They'll charge for every part of it. Very small number of organizations do both ISO and SOC 2. It tends to be large SaaS companies. So you will see that Salesforce has done both, Microsoft has done both. They tend to be organizations for whom the cost of doing both certifications is a vanishing number, and it's worth their while doing it. They can afford it. Small and medium businesses tend to try and focus on one where they can. It tends to be ISO 27001 because that's generally applicable. Where they have to do SOC 2, they'll do SOC 2. and try and build into that ISO 27001 because of the general benefit they get out of it. While implementing all TSCs so depends on what you've got in place. If you're a very security conscious organization, you could go from nothing to ready for audit in between 2 and 4 months. If you're quite a long way behind, it could take a year or more. ISO 27001, it's a management system. So again, it depends on the extent to which you currently have in place what you need to do. But for an organization with up to 500 employees, we typically expect, with management commitments, something in the order of 6 months or so. Could take 9, could be done more quickly than that, but typically somewhere in the 6 months or so tends to be a reasonable framework for an organization to get there. So it's not much in terms of time difference. Project teams tend to be different. You tend to need more in the way of specialist technical security project teams for a SOC 2 implementation. You need more process quality management teams for a ISO 27001 implementation. Typical timeline. Some organizations ask for SOC 2. Some organizations who've asked for SOC 2 under pressure clients have come to accept that ISO 27001 could be a better deal for them. You can absolutely enhance ISO 27001. What that means is you'll have an ISO 27001 certificate, which will be valid for 3 years, or its 3-year cycle. You can use exactly that framework to build your SOC 2 implementation, have a SOC 2 audit. It's a bit like having a pin cushion with 2 pins stuck in it. Your SOC 2 audit will expire at the end of a year. The ISO 27001 element will still be valid until the end of its 3-year cycle, but it's the same set of controls and processes being audited for 2 different standards, which is why you'd want to write them in the same way so they're capable of being audited for 2 different standards. We are coming to the bits, so I'm going to pick the last few questions. Organizations under 100 people, you'd be thinking maybe between 3 and 6 months for a fast track implementation, again assuming that you've got management commitment to doing it, and again depending on, it's not very, very complicated. Medical industry, we know high trust. We could certainly do a similar event for high trust. High trust is slightly different to SOC 2 in terms of its requirements, but we could certainly do a similar comparison. High trust, because of specific requirements, tends to have broader applicability than SOC 2 does, but we could certainly look at doing a similar session. We'll take it away and see if we can plan that in. If you already have a QMS system in place for medical devices, so presumably ISO 13485, it should be possible to graft 27001 onto that relatively easily. You should have a number of the key elements and processes there. You'll have a continual improvement process in place. You'll have a management framework. So it tends to be less expensive for us to graft ISO 27001 onto an existing QMS, whatever the framework. So it could be an ISO 9001 or 45001 or 14001 or whatever it is. We can build 27001 onto that much more easily because ISO is ISO. It's the same for, it's the same clauses 4 to 10 that you've got to implement. It's the same layout. It's, you know, you can repurpose processes so that they do a job across multiple standards, and it can be cost effective to manage. You can manage multiple standards without having to have them all siloed inside an organization. So it can be very cost effective from that point of view. So to set up an ISMS, no, you can set up an information security management system without meeting any requirements. An information security management system is, in its simplest terms, how an organization manages information security. If you want to save time and do something which tens of thousands of organizations around the world have found works and which people have contributed to because it works, then get a copy of ISO 27001. It's $150 or something, and do what it says. Get one of the books, even one of the ones I've written on ISO 27001, and follow its guidance. It'll save you an awful lot of time you go up fewer dead ends and bad paths. Implement an ISMS, but if you're implementing one, we've found time and time again, you may as well do the extra mile of getting certification, because that gets everybody across the organization focused where you want them to focus. And the benefits get to be huge. You know, you get all of the organizations coming in questionnaires, and you just go, here's my ISO 27001 statement of applicability. You can substantially reduce workload for organizations there that you can't do with SOC 2. So if you're going to do it, we'd always advise just go the whole hog, get certification. It keeps people focused thereafter. It looks after the continual improvement of your information security management system. Folks, we're out of time. I hope it's been a useful hour. I know we're sharing the slides and the recording. I believe we'll send out links to that over the course of the next couple of days. So I hope you found it useful. Please do give us feedback. We'd like to put into future presentations whatever we can do that makes them more useful to you as we deliver the series into our growing American audience and client base. I hope you all have a very successful Thursday. Thank you all for your time.